All right. Webinar is now live.
All right. People, let's see what I've got. I'm trying to find my chat. There we go. Welcome. Folks are coming in. Good morning from Pacific Coast. Afternoon for those East Coasters. Nighttime for those Europeans, if there are any. Not sure about Asia. I always get the late night from us here in California. I'm gonna let a few more folks arrive. And get the A-OK from our technical producer, Katie Emmerich, that we're good and streaming on Facebook. Good morning. Hello. Great to see folks. Yeah, super nice. Let's see what we can see. Just a few more seconds all. We have about 61 folks joining right now. How great. Really appreciate people taking time out of their day to join us for this. Okay. Katie, you let us know when we're able to get going. Great, thanks, Katie. Close. I don't know, is how much overlap? We've got a question before we go. This is much more of a straightforward presentation. This afternoon's webinar on the Make community channel at Plan C is going to be a little bit more discursive. This is a real straightforward presentation of our findings. So let's get going. My name is Sabrina Merlo. I'm from Open Source Medical Supplies. I am, let's see, let's get out of there. I am really happy to invite you all and to start this presentation on this report that Open Source Medical Supplies and Nation of Makers has been working on for the last few months. I want to introduce my co-authors and co-presenters here today. This is not all of the authors that contributed to this incredible document, but here today to present is Guy Cavalcanti from Open Source Medical Supplies. We've got Dorothy Jones-Davis from Nation of Makers, Tobias Demmel from Open Source Medical Supplies. And we have a number of the authors, the co-authors also in the audience. Chat, please do leverage chat. And also the Q&A. If you can post your questions into the Q&A feature, that's what we'll be using to manage Q&A at the end of the presentation. So why don't we get going? This is a report on the open source maker and manufacturer response to the COVID-19 PPE crisis. Open Source Medical Supplies and Nation of Makers teamed up to measure and report about the open source emergency maker response to the COVID-19 induced medical supply shortages, primarily last year, that are continuing into current day. Our goal with this document is to spread this information far and wide to help educate policymakers about the response, open source networks and methodologies, and how those policymakers might be able to better sustain those grassroots networks in their communities. Open Source Medical Supplies was founded on March 10th of last year to help makers fight COVID-19. It started initially, the first, I think, 18 hours of OSMS was as a Facebook group around an open source ventilator project. It quickly changed to accommodate the larger issue at hand, which is PPE and medical supplies that healthcare workers were needing, called Open Source COVID-19 Medical Supplies is the name of the Facebook group. And it quickly became an international forum connecting makers around the globe. We became a nonprofit project hosted by Resolve. Shortly thereafter, we were funded by Schmidt Futures, the McGovern Foundation, Toyota Research Institute, and other private donors. And that's one to Dorothy.
So Nation of Makers, we're a national nonprofit organization. We're fiscally sponsored by Strong City, Baltimore. We were founded in 2016, coming out of the Obama administration, although we are nonpartisan. And our role is really to support maker organizations through community building, resource sharing, and advocacy. And throughout this effort, I mean, a lot of our role is really in doing that. How do we bring together our community? How do we provide resources and updates, access to funding for PPE production, giving calls to action to the network throughout the pandemic to get them to produce this PPE. We're also proud to be a co-producer of the weekly Plan C community show, which will be this evening with Make Community and my co-host Dale Doherty. And we're going to jump right in because we have a lot of data, but the reality is that we had a huge impact. And the highlights, which many of you have already seen, is that we had over 42,000 citizen responders from over 1,800 individuals and groups that we tracked in this report in 86 individual countries that produced 48.3 million, more than 48.3 million pieces of PPE and medical supplies. And if you put a value on this, we evaluated it at $271 million worth of supplies that were manufactured. And I think the thing that you really need to take is that last little box there, the volunteerism. So 93% of these efforts were volunteers. These were people that were not compensated for their efforts. And as you can see, they had a tremendous impact on the world's response to COVID-19. Really, the way that we did this, a little bit about the methodology here. Oh, that's not going to work. Okay. A little bit about the methodology here is that we tallied open source maker production in a few ways. So we began tallying how many supplies open source communities were producing every week starting in March 2020 in order to capture the bottom-up response. And then OSMS, which had been doing this weekly tally, many of you participated in on Facebook, then partnered with us at Nation of Makers to issue the community impact survey in the fall of last year in order to gather more comprehensive data and ask some more detailed questions and distill lessons learned from our open source response. So the findings that you read in the report and that you're hearing today are a combination of these two data sets. And then there was an additional survey that came to us from Fab Foundation that was administered to their Fab Lab network. We also did a lot of qualitative data gathering, and what we did is we really took the community impact survey and the data, the qualitative data that was received through that survey, as well as follow-up interviews with countless key individuals from the Citizens Maker Response, which include, physicians, healthcare workers, makers themselves, to compile this all together. So really, we're going to go through this stuff very, very fast. As you probably, for those of you that received the report that are here today and looked at it, you'll see it's a very, very large report. But we really want to highlight for you today, the problem and its causes. What is the citizen maker response? Who produced supplies? What are the critical resources that we use for design and production? Of course, we want to delve into the impact of the response and some of the metrics. We do want to talk about how the problem has evolved, because we're still in the midst of this pandemic. We can't say that it's over. And then we really want to finish up with opportunities for policy reform, which are a series of recommendations that we have for policymakers as to how we can better utilize the citizen maker response to have a better impact in future pandemics and crises. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Guy, who's going to get us started with the problem.
So we're not going to belabor the point too much, but basically the fundamental problem is that we had PPE supply shortages and just kind of widespread issues with the logistics chain and the supply chain throughout the pandemic that made it really, really difficult to protect our healthcare workers, protect essential workers, and keep people from catching and transmitting the virus. We knew about this beforehand. The HHS basically just said outright that we didn't have masks in the stockpile that we needed to make it through a respiratory pandemic. And very early on, within a week of the pandemic really starting to take off in the US, we were seeing hospital administrators making face masks in cafeterias by hand. Let's see. So we also saw medical supply shortages kind of across the world. None of this was surprise when it happened in the US or when it happened across the world. We saw patients in Italy being triaged based on how many ventilators were available. We saw oxygen running out in Italy right at the start. We saw PPE being unavailable in different parts of the world. And, to exacerbate this, we saw this kind of first use in many parts of the world, in many Western parts of the world, of widespread face masks, right? So we saw the CDC call on every American to be wearing a face mask, which is at least 328 million face masks that may not have existed before. So we saw an existing crisis where supply chain failed, and then we saw the need for far more PPE on top of the exponentially increasing demand for PPE and other supplies. And just to briefly talk through this, one of the fundamental contributing factors to this is just-in-time inventory practices, where everybody in the supply chain tries to keep stock to a minimum, right? You're trying to keep raw materials to a minimum. You're trying to keep things on shelves to a minimum. You're trying to keep production quantities to a minimum, so that everybody has slashed inventory and everything is operating in a perfect, streamlined way. And unfortunately, what that means is that we're explicitly incredibly vulnerable to any sort of failures in the supply chain. So, before the pandemic hit, 70% of the US's mouth and nose PPE came from China. And about 50% of PPE generally came from China. And then China quarantined 760 million people, about half its population, right at the start of COVID-19. And so you have this situation where literally half the population of China is in their homes, not making anything, while the virus is growing exponentially everywhere else. And so it started this cascading failure that actually still hasn't recovered across the supply chain as a result of kind of these precautions that China took to keep its population from getting very sick. What this meant is an immediate increase in price of supplies across the board. So we saw markups that were anywhere from 100% markup to 1100% markup for things like surgical masks in a hospital system that was already basically cutting a lot of the more profitable services that it could offer to keep their revenues up in order to treat COVID-19. So we see this kind of like black swan event, this worst possible case scenario. And to illustrate the point, we actually saw major international criminal cartels switch from like cocaine to moving masks, right? When we're talking about like how profitable this was, it's like we started, seeing the mafia moving medical supplies instead of illicit drugs. Um, and this is what the logistics failures look like as people stopped shipping, as people stopped flying. Cargo capacity of airlines dropped through the floor because 90% of all commercial flights stopped. So people started putting boxes in seats. There were miles long lines of tractor trailers that took multiple days to actually just get to the port to unload the boxes for customs to make it in. Ocean shipping is still 400% more expensive than pre-pandemic levels, and all berths and containers are sold out for months. So right now, not even like back then, but like right now, you can't make something new in China and get it to the US in bulk unless you've already purchased container berths and containers and like have the contracts in hand. It will take you several months to get things anywhere. So we're still seeing these supply chain failures across the board. Um, so yeah, that being said, back to Sabrina to talk about what Citizen Makers did.
People started to move. People started to get in action. Makers Gonna Make is a pretty popular hashtag out there on social media. And this community of folks that understand how to share information and collaborate, it started to get to work producing supplies. So from all of the multiple survey points, our data, we had reports of over 48.3 million units of supplies created. The breakdown here, the majority reported to us was 52% were face shields, another 16% isolation or protective gowns, 12% cloth masks, with a market value of $271 million. This is, an impressive output. I think there's also amazing productivity and impact in some of the smaller numbers of actual devices. Sorry, the smaller output numbers of critical devices like PAPRs, ventilator ports, and smaller devices. Pretty incredible output. And let's move. There we go. As a result, an incredible ecosystem evolved here. We have a tremendous new asset available to the world in the form of open source medical supply designs. These designs did not exist before the pandemic. Our library at Open Source Medical Supplies features over 200 designs across 35 categories, and those are a curated selection of the kinds of the numbers of designs that are out there. They range in, they're designed for like low resource environments and high resource environments, all the way from handmade scissors all the way through injection molding. And it's quite the impact of the design repository is enormous, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out over time. I think this one is back to Dorothy.
Yes. So, again, we had people from all over producing, at least 42,000 people working in 86 countries around the world. You see a little heat map here of where folks were working. This is a global effort and had impacts, globally. And then really, there was, a real-time design, factor that happened. So there are large open source forums that featured 10,000 to 74,000 people working together to rapidly collaborate and design. Yeah, Guy, I was just thinking, this is actually your slide. I'm not doing a good job because this is your slide. Do you want to go ahead and take over?
Sure, I can take over. Sorry about that. Dorothy's coming up in just a second. So real-time medical supply design. So basically, there were a couple of things that happened. One is um, a bunch of engineers and a bunch of designers congregated in centralized places that were big focal points to just swap best practices, open source designs, feedback on designs, things like that. And these look like the open source COVID-19 medical supplies forum on Facebook, helpful engineering, just one giant lab, viral response, Prusa forum, station and maker forums, things like that. The goal here was get a lot of people looking at a lot of designs moving very quickly. And these forums saw like hundreds of posts a day. Each post might get 10 to 30,000 views in their various areas, and people got design feedback incredibly quickly, and were able to produce things and design things that we had never attempted to as a community design before. Let's see. And what this looked like in practice is, on March 16th, you had Joseph Prusa release the Prusa RC1 face shield, right? On March 19th, across the world, Tim Prestero, Design That Matters, actually modified the Prusa shield for University of Washington Harborview Medical Center and put that kind of visor on top to prevent aerosols from coming in the top. And then that got listed, for example, on the NIH 3D print exchange. So you get to see this kind of global transfer of information back and forth, evaluation by these medical groups that had never actually taken responsibility for vetting supplies before. This is usually the FDA's job. This is usually the NIH's job. It's not the job of any particular hospital, but in this case they stepped up to be able to do this in a crisis. And so you see this global design iteration, and then you see this big push for design for manufacturing, right? When it became obvious that the need was so large, everybody started moving through kind of classic engineering design for manufacturing phases, right? One of the first face shields that we were able to put into the open source medical supplies project library was something you could make with a pair of scissors and a 2-liter bottle, right? And this takes a person a half hour to make, but if you are completely out and you need a thing right now, you can make it. And then Prusa comes out with this face shield that can be made pretty simply with a 3D printer and a hole puncher and scissors. And then that has a certain production rate that's maybe 5 to 6 times faster than scissors and a 2-liter bottle. And then you start getting into totally laser cut shields and then die cut shields, and then you realize, oh, actually we need injection molding, and this is where we take off and start making hundreds of thousands of units a week. Let's see here. On top of that, you start seeing this kind of novel invention happening because of these gigantic centralized forums, right? So we didn't just have designers and engineers in these forums, we actually had clinicians on the ground who would come post and say, hey, the skin on the back of my ears is like cracked and bleeding because I'm wearing this this disposable N95 for 12 hours a day, which I'd never done before in my life, as an attending person. Can we do something about this? And then people in the group would invent ear savers that go on the back of your head and take the loop and relieve the strain on your ear. Sewists in the group would say, hey, I can only make one cloth mask a day because the act of pleating folds really sucks. Or I can only make so much bias tape in a day because the act of folding it and then sewing it sucks. And then you would have people in the same group who'd be like, I can design a thing and 3D print it to make that easier. So now you have mask pleating jigs for distributed manufacturing that increased sewist productivity by 10x, right? As a result of being in the same group with engineers, designers, and people with printers. And you started seeing, clinicians designing their own products from scratch as they ran out of supplies and had no other options. So like intubation boxes to actually offer another line of defense against aerosolized virus when you're actually putting a breathing tube down someone's throat. So you start to see this kind of collaboration and medical evaluation in ways that had never happened before, in bottom-up ways, by participating in these design engineering communities. You saw them calling makers to action because they were out of things or they needed something. You saw partnerships between makerspaces and hospitals for the first time ever. You saw them developing new supplies themselves from scratch, testing them for efficiency in, like a level 5 environment, which is crazy, right? It's like, here's this 3D printed face shield that I just pulled off the internet. Please test to make sure it works against virus. Oh, sure. I'm going to take this to my level 5 laboratory and spritz it with live virus and then detect what's on the inside, right? Like, that's nuts. that doesn't happen in day-to-day life, right? And then on top of that, you saw groups of clinicians like Get Us PPE providing demand data and allocating resources to makers to actually keep the movement alive and keep people producing things. I also do want to note that there were some government actions that were incredibly helpful very early. The FDA was nimble in ways that nobody who's ever watched it for a long time has ever expected, right? In kind of introducing the emergency use authorizations and creating blanket emergency use authorizations for things like face shields, saying, hey, this class 1 device, if you make it in the following way with the following materials and label it appropriately, this can be used in a clinical setting, right? And that's also crazy, right? That's usually the FDA approves your manufacturing process, your labeling process, and then gives you the stamp. And this was kind of a unprecedented way of just saying, okay, go for it, here you go. And we saw entities like the NIH basically take their 3D print exchange and just do a hard 90-degree turn incredibly quickly to say, okay, we had been doing this kind of cool prototype bleeding edge thing, and now we're providing a resource for makers around the world to create medical supplies that have been reviewed for clinical use, which is also a huge turn that I do want to give the government credit for here in the US. There are some local and state governments that work directly with makers. It's definitely not the usual is what we found, but there were some particularly nimble government agencies that did help. And now I want to turn back to Dorothy.
Now it's my turn. Yay. Okay, this is more of my wheelhouse of who produced supplies. So you might be wondering, who are these makers, right? Like, and what does maker kind of mean here when we talk about the citizen maker response? If you look at the data, there are a number of types of makers. So we had folks that were retooled manufacturers. These are people that before the pandemic were making one thing and then they had to nimbly pivot to something else and they run to help. So they might have changed to producing masks or face shields. 42% of our data came from those individuals. We had makerspaces or fab labs, which is another really large group, but these are spaces that are already there. A lot of them were shuttered. They were already closed because of the pandemic. You have to realize these are small businesses and communities, and because of the COVID restrictions, they often had to come up with and figure out a process to be able to go into their spaces safely, to be able to use equipment. We had lots of distributed online groups. Universities and colleges played a big role. Many universities and colleges did in fact liberate equipment, either sending it home with students or allowing some subset of faculty into makerspaces within the university setting to produce PPE. We had a fair number of individual makers, as well as K-12 schools and school groups, which is really, really lovely to see. And I know even my own daughter's school really got engaged in this conversation around, how do we do better for our communities? Everybody really wanted to do their part. And the interesting thing is that these are really small groups. So when we say groups, we're not talking about thousands of people at one time in some like really super organized thing. 81% of people that were responding are groups that had fewer than 50 people involved. And so if you look at that little circular graph over here on the side here, the size of the organizations that responded, most people were individual makers. These are individual people that decided that I want to do something in my community. I want to make something to change my community. I want to design something to help my community. And that's really a part of the remarkable story here. So I'm going to go through just very quickly, and I messed up, and let me go back. There we go. Thank you. So our retool manufacturers are small to medium-sized manufacturers. They produce more than anyone else, as you could imagine, because once they were able to retool, they made, for example, a lot of face shields. So as soon as they figured out how to make a face shield and they were able to get the equipment, they were able to, share their high-volume medical supply designs early. They were able to retool and get high-volume manufacturing equipment, and also they already had the production staff, so they just had to tell them, hey, now you're going to make this thing. And they also were very successful at forming manufacturing partnerships with healthcare because, they had established relationships. And so some notable examples are Kaz Tailored, Daniels Woodland, Budman, Zverse, and many, many others. Makerspaces also obviously played a pivotal role. They were design hubs that really could prototype for healthcare institutions. There was a lot of rapid prototyping happening, as Guy mentioned, between healthcare folks that were in the healthcare sector that then could give feedback to a makerspace. This is how you need to fix this so it doesn't actually cut in, or it's actually more protective. One of my favorite examples is actually the design for the face shield. The Prusa face shield initially did not have a lid or like a cap to sort of protect. And that was an iteration that came about to, that healthcare individuals came back and said, no, this is still not safe enough. Can you fix it so that it's safer? And that was something that happened. Obviously, there were manufacturing hubs, although they can't manufacture quite as much as our retooled manufacturers, they're able to do a fair amount of production. And they have memberships that are really already tuned into the community. These are people this is their community. They want to help their own community. And so they're very tuned into that volunteerism. And we have some really notable volunteers, that were at Artisans Asylum making isolation gowns, at OpenWorks making, face shields. There's Maker Nexus that was doing an incredible job, Maker Lab, Make It Labs, and many, many others. We also had distributed manufacturing groups. Now, these are groups that kind of started up. These were online networks, people that often did not know each other at all and were very distributed. And they often were able to, centralize design decisions and come up with a centralized design that everyone would produce remotely in their specific areas. And they would, distribute those fabrication responsibilities. They were able to aggregate the amount of equipment to do this because they were distributed, right? So if every person has a 3D printer, and that 3D printer can make a certain amount of stuff, and there's 100 of those 3D printers, then you're able to sort of aggregate those supplies. The other thing that's really amazing here is that because they're in a local area, those folks often were able to give the PPE that they produced in their homes or in their spaces to their local area. And there wasn't a shipping cost. There wasn't necessarily as much of a delivery and distribution cost. And so some examples here are the M19 Collective, Zverse, the Illinois PPE Network was extraordinary. Joanne, the fabric store, did an incredible job at doing this by just distributing little packets of fabric and some instructions on how to make a mask. Something Labs is another really, really great example here. But honestly, our individual makers, if you're an individual maker, kudos to you. I really wish I could hug you and it was socially safe to do so. But they were really well positioned to help their communities because they were really responsive. Many folks knew a healthcare worker. They were in touch with somebody who was a frontline worker, who was an essential worker at a store or, in a community. And they really were able to communicate very clearly with those individuals to get valued information to iterate on their designs. They were able to produce a large number of helpful, simple supplies for communities, those bias tape makers that Guy pointed to. And they're really agile, right? Like you guys are just able to, you're nimble, you're willing to help out and support your community. And so, hey, can you make this? Yes, I can absolutely do that. And so we have a few names, but these are not all the names by any stretch of imagination. Dave O'Meara, Nicole Angel, Nick Franklin, and so many more all over the world. And Nicole here is shown here making her 2,350 cloth mask that she made herself, which is a feat if you've ever made a mask. It's a lot. So thank you. Our colleges and universities are incredible. We're so grateful to you. There was a little bit of conversation around colleges and universities as to whether or not it was safe or there was liability involved with making PPE, but many maker spaces that were on college and universities campuses actually were able to pivot. They were able to help, use their maker spaces, that sometimes we're actually in a hospital setting. So there are makerspaces in universities that have a hospital care system that were able to pivot and help. UCSF is an example of that I know of. They have experienced faculty and staff that could cross departments and help iterate. So engineering departments got involved. Again, the healthcare workers in the medical schools got involved. They were familiar with the open source ethos and the need for testing and production, and they were able to utilize the infrastructure that was at the university they were at to do that. And then they had willing participants. These students are incredible. They want to give back. They want to do something that's going to change things, and they have a lot more time than other people sometimes. So some notable examples are the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Case Western Reserve University, and Modesto Junior College. And now I'm going to turn it over to Toby, who's going to pivot us to what are some other resources that we had for design and production.
All right, so this is all a massive undertaking, and you have to imagine that there's tons of things required for this, right? And one of the central things is the social glue that brought all of these people together. So out of the things that people found helpful, we found in our survey basically that a lot of them found it helpful to just get to know other people that do the same thing, right? Because you no longer feel alone, and there's a motivation to keep going. There's a motivation to keep sharing information. For example, if the demand goes down in one area but goes up in another area, makers can work together to then produce supplies for that area. The entire grouping system was very useful. We had a Facebook group of 72,000 people constantly coordinating with each other and talking. Funding and grant opportunities, all of these things were immensely important for people to actually do their work, right? And so it was about all of this organizing work that happened in the middle. There was entire nation scale networks in countries all around the world that helped each other. And the OSMS Facebook group was oftentimes sort of a hub where everybody came together, shared insights, and then went back to actually making things, right? So only about 30% of the people found actual funding and grant opportunities helpful, because a lot of them were able to source that in their own local communities. But really, the main takeaway here is that there was a huge community, and this community effort was what fueled a lot of this massive output, right? Because people just saw each other do it, and it became, if you will, viral. Manufacturing resources, you can kind of group them into two separate categories. The one is rapid prototyping, and the other one is mass production. And there was a very good spread and a broad diversity of tools utilized in our survey in this entire maker universe. So most people had access to something like a 3D printer or a sewing machine. Those were really the main tools, if you will, by individual people to contribute. But there's been groups that had, dozens and dozens of 3D printers all in one row, daisy chained, just printing over and over 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, nonstop, finding ways to automate the production with 3D printers, which is sort of unprecedented. And also the use of laser cutting, right? There's many countries around the world where 3D printers are very expensive because they're all imported, but they can locally produce laser cutters. So in India, for example, laser cutters were an immensely important tool. And then as you had more people coming together, producing these supplies, there was a sort of understanding we need to make a lot of these things, right? And with rapid prototyping, you can only get so far in terms of volume. So sometimes the maker groups would actually together, do a GoFundMe, raise cash, and then use that to actually spend it on injection molding dies. These are, say, $5,000 per die. It's a huge undertaking, but then you have somebody helping out from the local community, a plastic injections manufacturer that says, we'll give you the space for a discount, and we'll just help you produce tons and tons of face shields or whatever other supplies there were. Vacuum molding, die cutting, die casting. So we had so many different large-scale applications as well in the maker groups. And then, of course, from the retooled manufacturer side, those were immensely useful as well. But what is, I think, incredibly significant is that there was individual groups of people that all just said, our 3D printers aren't fast enough. Let's just pool money together and basically purchase a production run of 200,000 face shields in our local town. The funding and donations came from all over the place, right? There was many different ways that people were able to fund this undertaking. A huge amount came actually from getting material. So different companies would donate, say, filament, for example, for 3D printers, or would donate fabric for sewing machines. Many makers just paid for this themselves. They literally just ran on volunteer power, volunteer capital contributions, volunteer time, just everything for the goodwill, because everybody knew in this community that there was a crisis, right? And without making these supplies, people, their lives were at risk of, many people had friends that were working in hospitals. And so you could see the actual impact of the work that you were doing in real time. Only about 2% or 3% of the people received money from the government. And this was sort of a broad pattern that we saw in our report, is that most of the government funding and most of the government collaboration was on a small scale with local towns, local governments, where people kind of knew each other and could coordinate locally. There was a few exceptions of this in other countries, like in Spain, the military helped, for example, to distribute supplies. But for the vast majority, governments around the world were very hands-off, except for sort of the local governments that really helped. And some governments allowed, for example, these emergency use authorizations. Out of all of this, you have 93% volunteer work that creates about $270 million worth of medical supplies in the middle of a crisis when everybody else is having a hard time to retool and ramp up production. So this was a very significant way of utilizing this very limited amount of funding for maximum impact. And then some of these funding and donations were very proactive. So there was both from nonprofit grant makers as well as for-profit companies that would donate supplies. And so, sort of a good example is Get Us PPE, which is an organization that was founded by doctors to supply PPE to different hospitals and actually transmit the demand signal, which is always very hard to get to figure out where is something missing. They put together grants, for example, for gown making. So they would work together with Something Labs to create gowns, and with Artisans Asylum. And so that was basically a way for steering specific grant monies towards making specific supplies for specific areas where doctors knew that there was a need. And then Coca-Cola actually donated about 100 metric tons of PETG plastic material. So this was partially the makers and partially the company that said, you know what, we see that this effort is happening and we know that you guys need tons and tons of plastic. We make this stuff for our bottles. Why didn't you take a few rolls? And they would deliver this by the truckload. Makers would offload it and then put it on individual pickup trucks and drive it across the state to drop off at each other's facilities, and then use it actually for laser cutting or for other applications to make face shields out of it. And then there was, of course, the 3D printer filament donations that were incredibly helpful for individual makers that were just running their 3D printers hot all the time. Their printer heads were melting. And so this filament was incredibly useful. And McMaster-Carr, for example, donated prototyping supplies, super useful for the scaling of production. And we had a design repository on OSMS. There was other repositories online as well. So here you can see a little bit of an impression of individual maker designs that were submitted. They were validated through our technical team, validated by the medical team for utility, for production speed. And oftentimes they would be replaced by a more and more optimal design. So makers sort of saw the inspiration from each other, designers, engineers, and through this constant sharing and iterative process, the designs became better and faster and more efficient. So as time went on, the face shields, for example, that were done with 3D printers would use less and less filament and be able to be printed faster and faster. We had, for example, the Joanne fabric donations, and then a way for makers to say, okay, here's a pattern. This is what I can make. A way to actually sell it online. So there was a way to try to make it financially sustainable at scale. And then the NIH, with its very significant 3D print exchange, a lot of people submitted to this. The NIH actually looked through these designs, validated them, published them. So this was a real effort by the government to actually provide a repository for people to say, these are NIH approved in a way, with an emergency use authorization with an asterisk. These are approved for you to actually make, and that lend a lot of credibility to the makers that made these supplies, and for doctors and nurses to be able to trust them that these supplies would work, right? MakerBot, Thingiverse, Banner Hackers, Wikifactory, Viral Response, so many places came together and said that we will provide our infrastructure, our software solutions, our communities to actually spread these designs and make them accessible for makers all around the world. And I will hand it over to Sabrina now.
Well, around the same time, everyone was in action. The larger organizing groups. Oh, did we lose? I got a little out of order here. So the larger organizing groups started to track and map the response. Open source medical supplies started a local response network. We were registering groups. I know that Fab Foundation started to have communications and started to map who was out there working. Nation of Makers was coordinating with their constituents around the work that they were doing. Find the Masks was an effort that was a PPE matching platform that had built a map, and Nation of Makers connected with them to talk about a maker layer, a find the makers layer. So they started populating and working together on this implementation for Find the Makers. Open source medical supplies and Fab Foundation pooled our data so that we could have a great visual representation for not only the makers to find each other, but for healthcare workers and the general public to locate supply. This ended up, I think currently it's 895 groups. I do think it is the most comprehensive view of the citizen maker response out there on the web currently. Let's click, there we go. Additionally, the larger umbrella organizations started to collaborate and communicate about what was happening to see how we could help. What's not on this slide is what the manufacturer agencies or the manufacturer coalitions were doing as well. I think this was a pretty consistent effort of people connecting, networking layer by layer from the local all the way to the most global. What's interesting also is how, like this is one example, we started meetings, the Global Coalition for Local Manufacturing came together with these 5 organizations. And at the same time, there's an evolution of the local response internationally. Some countries actually really organized to a full nation scale. Makers Asylum in India, for example, Makers versus Virus in Germany, Protege BR in Brazil, Visier Solidaire in France. These full sort of nation networks, we were communicating, and then additional layer of an organization or sort of a channel of communication, the International COVID-19 Local Manufacturing Information Network has been communicating through the response and continuing thinking about open health and how open source can create access to better health for people around the world. So interesting layers of networking happening on every level.
And so just to talk through the impact of the response, and I think what really makes this response special, makers didn't have necessarily the highest production output compared to centralized manufacturers, but where they were operating, they were able to make big results, right? Like they were able to go to hospitals with enough face shields, masks, whatever, for all of the staff at any given place, right? When you look at the needs of every single person, right, on Earth, it's overwhelming. But when you look at, hey, I have a group of 50 people who all have fabrication equipment, and there's a hospital down the street that needs face shields, we can do it, right? Like we can make enough face shields for that hospital. So we started seeing all of these, healthcare workers, pouring in saying, you helped us in this time of crisis. We're so grateful. When you are looking at kind of where things went generally, um, most makers, 76 and 72%, reported giving PPE or medical supplies to hospitals or individual medical professionals, right? So, absolutely serving the front lines and trying to make sure they were okay in the early stages of the pandemic. But what is really incredible to me is actually where the rest of the supplies went, right? Because healthcare workers are, they absolutely need these supplies, but then, there's a whole bunch of other people who are hurting in the middle of this pandemic as it affects everybody. So, you're talking about distributing to senior housing, secondary care facilities, medical clinics that aren't the large hospital chains, right? You're talking about nonprofits and social service agencies serving low-income populations, and those populations themselves, essential workers, schools, first responders, and all that. So, this is really trying to take care of the elements of our communities that don't have the purchasing power of these large regional medical systems, buying in bulk once China caught up, right? It's the folks that got left out of that. Um, and what I do want to specifically point out is that makers were able to respond far faster than anyone else, um, even though they had to invent the entire medical supply design ecosystem from scratch in order to be helpful, right? So when you look at, the OSMS tally as compared to, caseloads in the US, right, there's only a couple of weeks lag in ramp up efforts. And, when 3M has publicized its data on N95, so we were able to strike a comparison, they grew their supply of N95s 42% in 16 weeks from March to July, while makers grew 653% in 5 weeks, which is a 50 times faster growth rate of production capacity, right? So the latent production abilities of the maker movement it's through the roof if it can be harnessed and maintained, right? In this case, what we saw is that there was this huge effort, and then it did drop off, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. One thing I do want to explicitly point out is that, as centralized manufacturers were able to produce more supplies, they were able to sell by the plane load at first. That was literally the minimum order quantity, was one plane arriving at your facility from a factory, and a plane load was usually, $5 to $10 million worth of a thing, right? So if you were Massachusetts, if you were, a 51 hospital chain, etc., you could order a plane load of thing and get it, and then put it in inventory and keep people safe for a while. If you're a nursing home, if you're a homeless shelter, if you're a school and you're trying to buy 100 of a thing, you don't have access to that entire supply chain, and that supply chain existed for months and still exists for some types of products. So when you look at what makers were able to make and what they're willing to make, 92% of maker responders reported that they're able to fulfill orders smaller than 150 units, right? So in terms of who can take care of these institutions that no longer have access to the primary market, makers can help those people in particular. And I do want to specifically point out, there are entire communities that were not getting served by the large supply chains. So $8 billion worth of CARES money was withheld by the Treasury Department for months after it was supposed to be released to tribal nations in the US. And, what ended up happening is maker groups sprung up specifically to supply tribal nations with PPE as a direct result of this withholding of money. And we were looking at a dashboard that I believe, Toby, you made this dashboard, is that right? Yeah. So Toby made a dashboard for Protect Native Elders to see where demand was to direct makers to send supplies. And I do want to also say that this is the type of thing that also supported rural areas, low income areas, right? When you look at a rural hospital that can't afford to compete in a PPE market at the best of times, much less when you have to order by the plane load, right? Now you have to find an alternative source in order to stay supplied. And that is where makers were able to shine in ways that traditional centralized manufacturers just couldn't, because they were dealing with demand through the roof that they couldn't service anyway. And now I believe we are back to Sabrina.
So the change in production occurred over time in terms of when we were polling the community of local responders in multiple instances. I think there's one here on the left is a poll that Guy did on our Facebook group in May of 2020. And then the community impact survey went out a little bit later in the fall. We had pretty consistent response that about half and half were active, half and half had gone inactive. But generally speaking, the primary reasons they reported were lack of requests, that their demand locally had diminished. They also reported challenges around lack of funding and having fewer volunteers. So this is the status of the folks that reported being active, and then another view on who had stopped. What I think was interesting was that what a huge percentage there, 75% saying that they would be willing to start again if the need arose. I think the other story here that is clear in the phenomenon that we saw and report on in the report is that over and over again, depending upon the product, as domestic supply and traditional manufacturers went into production and started producing at volume, and then finally Chinese imports or imports in general coming in to fulfill kind of the traditional supply chain, as those channels came on, the demand went down in the local areas. Although Guy is going to talk shortly about some of the data we see, especially from Get Us PPE, about unmet demand out there. It's certainly true that it seems like the opportunity or the potential for productivity in this group is disconnected from demand.
So to speak to that, Get Us PPE has been doing an amazing job of basically categorizing and presenting demand from all of these different areas throughout the pandemic. And it's a pretty sobering picture, right? So, as of December, just from the requests that Get Us PPE is getting through its own network, we need about 87 million pieces of medical supplies and PPE for just a week of demand that is going unfulfilled right now across just the US. And by comparison to the 87 million a week figure, Get Us PPE has distributed 6.5 million units of supplies total. Right. So just to give you an idea of the huge gap that still exists. The problem is a lot of these supplies are not things makers can make necessarily, right? So disinfecting wipes, nitrile gloves, and hand sanitizer are the top 3 most requested things per GUP's December report. And we are seeing, that a lot of this is just like people just don't have these things. It's to the point where it's not like supplies are low, it's that supplies are zero, right? So there are no bottles of hand sanitizer or gloves or disinfecting wipes, but it's a lot harder to ramp up that type of production. Next slide, Debbie. There are some areas where makers can help. So schools, for example, report needing a lot of the types of supplies that makers can make, right? So face shields, ear savers, door openers, partitions, hand washing stations, things like that. But it's a lot harder to service the actual healthcare facilities that are in need of a lot of things. So it's difficult. It's difficult to just conceive of this stark difference, right? Like the magnitude of the stark difference between, hey, makers made 48 million things. A lot of them are still willing to make stuff. In fact, there are, groups reporting needing 87 million pieces of things a week, right? And yet, most makers stop because they're disconnected from who actually needs things, or they just need funds to continue. So there's this huge information gap between what's being demanded, what's out, right? And then what people can make and the resources to actually make those things, right? So for example, schools, makers can make a ton of things for K through 12 schools. They don't know to talk to each other. They don't necessarily know how to talk to each other. So yeah, well, I'll talk more about that at the very end, but I think that's the summary for now.
Okay, so there's a lot of opportunities for policy reform, but before we get started, I do want to draw attention to time. It is 1:59 Eastern time, and I know many of you are doing this in the midst of a full-time job, so I do want to respect your time, and if you have to hop off, that's totally fine. This call is being recorded, or this seminar is being recorded, so we'll be happy to distribute to you. If you did stick a question in the question and answer, we will answer it. We will make sure that the answers are posted in that recording. And if you have to hop off and you do have a question, just drop it in that question and answer. We'll make sure that we address it. So now we're going to jump to policy reform. I think we learned a lot from this pandemic, and we learned a lot from the maker response to the pandemic. And I think, it's really captured in this quote by Craig Farrington from Factory 2, which is a lovely member of Nation of Makers. He said, now that we know that makerspaces can fill such a vital role, we need lawmakers to invest funds towards organizing these efforts and making sure that they have the materials and the support needed to ramp production up back when it's needed. And so we really have a value. We've hopefully articulated to you, and when you read the report, you'll understand the tremendous value that makers have, not only to the government, but to our communities globally. And there really needs to be support for this. So again, our US government involvement, we want to thank the folks that were in the government that did help, like the 3D Print Trust, VA, NIH, America Makes, but direct US government and the citizen maker response was really, really limited. 24%, only 24% of US-based survey respondents said that they had created a new relationship with some government agency, and only 2.8% received any type of government financial support, which is critical for labor. It's critical for materials and supplying materials. And again, you have to realize these, especially for the spaces, were places that were shuttered. In other words, COVID had kept them closed. So their normal revenue from programs, from memberships was not coming in. So these are folks that really were already suffering from COVID, reductions in their productivity. And it would be a boon for them to get additional support. So we really want to ask two questions today. How can we build on the momentum of the citizen maker response to COVID-19? And how can we create structures that integrate makers into the US domestic response, not just to this pandemic, but to a lot of crises that we have, which would allow makers to respond to other critical challenges, for example, floods, other natural disasters that may occur. And to drill down a little bit more, what specific policies and support, for example, increased access to funding, to raw materials, to testing facilities, partnerships with government entities, what do those look like at the local, state, and federal level? And how can they be developed in a way that really does help makers reach their fullest capacity? So our policy recommendations will be started out by Sabrina.
First recommendation is to fund and incentivize the citizen maker response. Whoops. Or actually the first is to formalize it, then fund it. We think there's opportunity to articulate this network in a way that would complement the work of the open source community and support it. The idea is potentially to create a reserve, a US prototyping and manufacturing reserve is referenced in the paper. A proposal that is live on the Day One project. A maker core is another way of framing it. The idea is that they would be connected, known by the state emergency response channels, and have better relationships to government, be better integrated into funding channels, and be able to be called upon in emergencies to help with that kind of rapid response that we have seen demonstrated so effectively by this network. Additionally, fund and incentivize this group. So there's really wonderful ways to support, especially the network of makerspaces that are out there cultivating skills, new businesses, as well as new products. Opportunities to do if an entity, a small business, a manufacturer, or a makerspace wanted to join such a reserve force, perhaps you could offer grant and capital improvement opportunities, provide access to loan programs, and build channels of communication so that when emergencies do go down, that the governments are aware of these entities and they can qualify for emergency funds as they move. and not just after. Another concept is to create a national version of what has been created across the open source hardware community here, which is a US digital stockpile. How can not only medical supply designs, but also all kinds of disaster response products be available in a US national digital stockpile, open source designs available for local manufacturing when it's needed. Dorothy, you want to take the next one?
Yeah, so additionally, I think one of the things that's been really remarkable is, the crowdsourced like citizen maker innovation that we talked about that was happening in all of these different online forums and across wide geographies of makers collaborating. But there also were specific challenge programs, the COVID-19 Maker Challenge, for example, by Challenge America, that were very, very important in coming up with that innovation and supporting it in large part. And so we recommend that there's an expansion of those challenge programs, including hackathons, that will allow individual knowledge bearers in the maker community and throughout the rest of the community to transfer their innovation expertise to the public and the private sectors. Another additional mechanism, and I welcome you to go to the Day One project, and you can read, Stephanie Santoso, myself wrote a Day One proposal on what it would look like to have a federal maker in residence fellowship program. And that would, place innovators and makers into temporary positions within the federal, state, or local government so that they can be there in the midst of something to be able to say, hey, this is a great way to do XYZ. Hey, maybe we can help to improve the US digital stockpile if we get that to happen. Or here's how we can, contribute in different ways. We also have the opportunity to talk and streamline pathways with regulators and testing facilities for open source designs. As many people know, we were operating under emergency use authorization to be able to produce these products. There wasn't a lot of clarity, and if you've ever read an emergency use authorization, it's written in a little bit of a different way for the layperson to understand. And so it's really important that the FDA and other regulatory agencies think about including dedicated staff to develop approval pathways for open source supplies and devices, and also to help, provide advanced coordination of the emergency use authorization so that they get to the people and people get to understand them in sort of common sense language, how they're able to adopt them, that is aligned with those digital stockpile designs and also those facilities. So if we do get a US PMR, you want that to be aligned with the facilities. And then incorporated into that regulatory pathway should be the expectation that we have testing, right? And we have access to testing, and that there's validation protocols and calibration tools for substantial testing equivalency. And that should be agnostic of where you are in your geography, right? Those testing facilities should be readily available because we want to produce things that are safe. And I know at the beginning of this, people were saying, maker stuff is not safe. It's not that makers don't want to create safe things. We were doing things in the best way that we possibly could, but access to testing facilities allows us to be safer. Additionally, a map of those certified testing facilities, both independent and those that may be housed, for example, at universities, at colleges, should be maintained as a resource in that digital stockpile. And then we want to also ensure access to those raw materials. So we saw those generous donations from Coca-Cola, for example, for PPE production. We know that Joanne gave a lot of fabric out, but we really want to identify, domestic PPE raw material suppliers. And we want to, not only identify them, but federally contract them. It might be close or similar to the SBA bidding contract system to constantly have a specified inventory, available to makers within the USPMR, or just makers in general that are producing for this disaster relief, disaster resiliency, crisis response within a certain time frame. So there's also a timeliness to this as well, right? And then we want to also reduce the burden of liability. clarifying, the liability landscape for medical institutions, and the citizen maker response at the beginning of the crisis. So one thing that happened is that there were a few authorizations, the Emergency Use Authorization, as well as the Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act, the PrEP Act, which provides immunity from liability for claims of loss that result from countermeasures to disease threats or other conditions. And it also covers folks that are involved in development, manufacturing, and distribution of such countermeasures, which are basically the makers. But a lot of people didn't know about this, right? So we want to make sure that there's an abundance of, the clarity of communication between, federal organizations, regulatory organizations, legislative organizations, and the maker community in plain language guidance, right, to increase the awareness of those policies that reduce the burden of liability, so that citizen makers can be the most effective. I think one example is, colleges and universities, their offices were, their legal offices were really, really freaked out about the idea of PPE being produced on college campuses. And I think just a knowledge of some of these, very swift moving regulatory practices or liability reducing legislation would really have been helpful. Sabrina, I realize I think I'm going, oh no, I'm not going through your slides yet. And so, we also want to make sure that we are facilitating new distribution and delivery pipelines. And no, this is your slide. Sabrina, I'm going to turn it over to you. I think I'm talking too much.
It's fine. Another aspect, another opportunity is to actually look at ways of aggregating small scale production. So how could this kind of local production be grouped in so that supply would be available for longer from these groups? I think there's also there's opportunities to tie that to the USPMR and or do it differently, but that's another recommendation. Let's go further. I think the other big issue, we're seeing lots of action by the new administration with the recent executive order on make it all in America. We need to create to increase national resilience to this problem of supply chain disruption across the board, but especially around medical supplies. The government needs to offer market subsidies and longer-term contracts to domestic manufacturers to ensure that we have high-quality product and PPE available here, as well as the quantities that we need. We want to require that all the PPE for the strategic national stockpile be domestically manufactured, and we need to promote a culture of willingness to pay more to fairly compensate American labor. We spoke with many representatives from medical institutions, a number expressing the desire to be able to purchase, but when the price is at a factor of 10 or something more than imports, it's difficult to do. Parting thoughts, Guy?
Yeah, so I think so generally speaking, some of the big lessons that I think we've all learned is that, open source allows for incredibly fast response. Traditionally, I think it's easy to think about open source design and development as a slow process, where, Linux evolves over a very long time, right? Or like a 3D printer design evolves over a very long time. In this case, I think we learned that if you actually have one thing to focus on, open source design and engineering can be incredibly fast, faster than almost any other centralized design effort. I think we learned, that there is a huge latent manufacturing capacity across the world. I think we learned that the supply chains that we have built as a result of, global trade are incredibly fragile, right? And, a lot of the lessons that you hear Dorothy and Sabrina talk about in terms of US policy apply everywhere, right? Like, it's not like we should do the US a different way than we're doing, Germany or France or India or wherever else. It's that, there are certain classes of products there are certain types of devices that are just necessary for any particular state or nation to be able to produce itself, to provide for its own citizens. Um, and that's a measure of resiliency that it's kind of difficult to overstate. We're still in this, right? It's not like this is the happy ending after everything got better, right? Like, we're still here. It's just that we have seen a lot of people stand down because they can't keep going, because they aren't being supported, because those resilience steps haven't been taken. So past that, I think looking forward, there's a huge opportunity to kind of take public health, right, as can be solved by manufacturing, and start to say, hey, this is open source, right? Like, this is actually standard of living stuff, right? You don't get to tell me that I can only wear a face shield from this one manufacturer in this one place that's approved by this one agency, if it's such a simple device that I can look online, get the information, go make it myself, and then go wear the thing, right? And I think there's a huge opportunity for the maker movement globally, to say, you know what, we're actually going to take this on. We're going to improve the quality of life of people around the world by giving them the tools they need to take care of themselves. Um, so, I think I want to thank everybody who has responded. I want to thank everybody who has um, taken the time to talk to us, right? I think we came off sometimes as pains in the ass, asking every Friday, what did you make this week? Stop the sewing machines and stop the printers and just tell us what you made this week. It's important. Um, there would be nothing to present. There'd be no lessons learned if we didn't actually take the time to reflect on a regular basis, and kind of do this necessary backup work. So thank you all, um, both for the incredible response across the world, and what the and thank you for participating in this whole process so that we can understand what made this particular thing go and possibly replicate it in the future. Um, and here's our contact information. The report will be posted to both websites soon, I believe, and will be going out in email very soon. It's a 97-page long actual report, um, which was worked on by more than, I think, like 15 or 16 people. So thank you all, and I think now
Yi, we have one
we'll
quick
take
question
a
that
bunch of
are,
questions.
yeah, one quick question we have is just, are we going to share the slides? So is that okay? Are we sharing the slides? Yes.
Yep.
Okay. So everyone, and I will put in the chat, we will be sharing these slides. I know a few people had asked that.
Great, and we can start to look at some of these questions. I know one of the questions from Russ Browder earlier on, he was talking about, interested to hear if it was all production or if some community networks also got involved in distributing supplies they sourced and purchased but did not make. Does anybody want to field that aspect of the kind of local response or networks?
Oh, yeah. So there were distribution networks set up at Makerspaces that handled a lot of early donations. Um, those, I think, accounted for something like 3 or 4 million units of supplies, I believe. We might have that data in the report, but it's like 10-ish% of total units delivered. Um, I know a lot of donation efforts petered out very early. So, as they ran out of stock, they stopped being able to produce or distribute.
I think
Yeah.
some places also acted as like hubs to receive other people's donations if they had a particular common design. So OpenWorks did this. They had like a place where you could donate your already made, like I printed it on my own 3D printer and I bring it in. I think the challenge also is around the testing, right? So if you have something done in-house, you're able to at least test it along your, you know how it was prepared. I think there is a little bit of a, there's trust, and then obviously just, ensuring a certain level of quality and safety safety. So I think that, you know, anecdotally in conversations with folks also contributed to the pittering out of that.
And maybe to add, you know, the international response, particularly because we did these very in-depth case studies on different country networks, right? There's literally millions of miles being driven by makers that deliver these things, hand deliver them to the hospitals. They're being made somewhere, they're being aggregated somewhere, and then they're being thrown in somebody's car, in somebody's truck, in a 16-wheeler. You make it, right? It was usually on wheels, and then it went somewhere. There's makers that distributed their supplies by going to the embassies of other countries in their country, and the embassies shipping the PPE to their country in order to use these supplies. So the distribution networks that were built as part of this are gigantic, massive, international, cross-national, inside of specific countries, local. It's at every single scale. But a lot of these makers didn't just go and make something and put it on a doorstep. There was so much effort being made that these things would actually arrive at the final destinations where they needed to be. Up to, you know, in India, for example, they had a system where the police would show up at the makerspace, pick up the supplies, drive it to the hospital, and then eventually they would have rows of ambulances waiting outside to get the face shields and then drive them straight to the hospital. So you had all sorts of different systems where makers were very proactively distributing.
Okay. Lisa Gethard adds a number of questions somewhat related to this issue of connecting unmet demand with supply from makers. And she's asking, wouldn't it be feasible to continue making these supplies and PPE due to the various strains and the sort of the ramp up of COVID-19? She's also talking about how could the Defense Production Act contribute to funding the citizen maker response and output of supply. Does anybody want to take that?
Yeah. So the lack of demand. So the production of supplies, one area that makers are less able to provide for is really specialized filtration. So N95 substitutes are difficult to manufacture just because the entire process of making them is it involves a specialized raw material that is itself in short supply, and a specialized electrostatic deposition process, which requires a lot of tooling. So it is very difficult to make properly filtering masks as makers that are N95 grade, which are the kind of predominant thing that's necessary right now for preventing community spread. That being said, there are a number of fabrics, there are a number of materials that do a slightly worse job of filtering that could be ramped up. One thing that we have perpetually seen is that there is no great tool right now to match supply and demand. There is no portal that is trusted where makers can make a supply that has been approved, that has been tested, that is a known good thing. There's no way to transfer that known good thing to customers that want those things. And this is something that OSMS has been pitching for a while. It is a resource that would take a lot of energy to do well, and a lot of care and attention and the right team. But so far, nobody has picked up that bit of infrastructure is actually really necessary to continue this whole thing. Like, yes, it is infrastructure that will cost a lot of money to build because you have to do it right, but it is really, really necessary to keep makers active. Like, they have to be paid for the things that they make, at least in terms of the raw materials that they're using. So I think that's a big unmet need.
Yeah, the nitrile gloves, for example, that are in really short supply right now. It's another example of need out there, an unmet need that is another product that's difficult to locally manufacture, requires highly specialized manufacturing equipment as well as raw material. How about, there is a question from Andrew Lamb. He's asking about, if this network or this community is able to engage the U.S. State Department around the policy issues. He's wondering about whether we think the U.S. could step up to demonstrate a kind of example of how this opportunity might be replicated around the
Well,
world?
my hope is yes, and I am certainly willing to say that, you know, Nation of Makers, many of you know, has been working a lot on sort of policy, especially in this transition period where we're transitioning. Or now we have transitioned to a new administration. There's lots of opportunities that are open, and I think, you know, with each new administration, there's new leadership in all of these different agencies, and that really is an opportunity for us to get in there and have a conversation about what the impact is and how, you know, we can regain our standing as a leader within, you know, sort of the global response to lots of different things, right? But this is certainly one of them. And I definitely am happy to see Nation of Makers engage in that. So if there's anyone listening from the State Department, I am happy to talk to you. You can reach out to me at dorothy@nationofmakers.us. I will definitely put in plug for that. But we definitely are trying to do that through our policy group work. We're trying to find individuals that are what we call maker allies. These may be people that are makers themselves, or at least just understand what the possibility is. And Andrew, I know you have a lot of sort of global policy experience, so I definitely will be also calling you for some guidance on that.
Okay, another question early in the presentation, but I think it's an interesting one about what did our data, did we collect data from the end user? What was the response from the healthcare workers? How did we measure that impact? Anyone want to take that one on?
Yeah, mostly, unfortunately, it's anecdotal. It is, you know, letters from hospital administrators saying thank you for supplies. Um, you know, what we were able to pull and what's in the report is some analysis on kind of the difference between having proper PPE and not. And you know, when you look in hospital settings over a long enough period of time, I believe, you know, healthcare workers that were equipped with PPE were like 60 to 70% less likely to contract COVID while treating positive patients compared to not. Um, so, you know, I don't think we have super hard data about healthcare workers. I do know, for example, many tribal nations actually were able to provide masks to their entire population. So there were some areas where makers actually provided everything. There were some case studies from Lithuania and Hungary where makers provided the entire hospital system's worth of need when the supply chain failed. So makers actually ramped up sufficiently to provide for everything that was needed. But it's a bit scattershot. I also know that that happened in the U.S. as well. I believe northern Alabama was entirely provided for by its makers. Like all of the need for their hospital supplies were provided by makers. So the scaling ability is there, but it's poorly distributed, let's say.
Okay, another question. Were there a lot of university makerspace partnerships? What kind of benefits emerged from that, like lab testing? I think we saw quite a bit of respondents who are coming out of university makerspaces, and Dorothy talked about that, but
yeah, I can speak a little bit to that. I mean, you know, the Badger Shield and the later variants were actually some of the very first face shield designs and some of the easiest to produce, and I think were made. They were made in some pretty significant volumes with participation from Ford and a couple of major manufacturers. You know, we saw some pretty crazy things happening. I believe Maker Lab in Durango, Colorado is school affiliated or museum affiliated, and they partner directly with a healthcare institution and actually directly tested. Um, they basically formed this rapid prototyping loop where the makerspace would create a supply item that was then immediately tested by the hospital. And they were actually developing like PAPR systems, like the purifying air respirators, and the kind of bunny suits that the hospitals needed that were in short supply. And you know, that kind of flywheel, particularly in a university setting where it's like, yeah, you have the teaching hospital, part of the university, and you have the makerspace in the engineering school, and those professors already know each other, right? Like that creates this really incredible prototyping space if you can build the network of trust that allows them to work together. So there were a couple of those. We do include them in the report.
Yeah, they have a unique opportunity as well because a lot of the universities have such high level relationships across their communities. So they could really access high level support and engagement with, like, there's a great case study in there about Case Western University's ThinkBox and how they were able to port straight at high level to big Cleveland hospital networks to advance designs and to serve those hospital networks.
Yeah, and where there was buy-in too, I mean, there's also university support in that structure. I mean, there's just so much support, like infrastructure support. So DePaul University, which was involved with the Illinois PPE network, it was, just very, very supportive. And so they got right on board. They didn't have any issues with, like, the students being involved, and they were really encouraging it, really aligned with their, DePaul University's mission to have an impact on the community. And they really rallied around it. And so I think where you saw that schools were supportive, they can dive right in and like Sabrina said, access and utilize those networks and their facilities and just all their big time, relationships with individuals within the community that can support the efforts as well.
Yeah, one thing that I wanted to add is both on Ivory Coast, in Brazil, and in many other countries, there was a very important role of the universities as being a proxy for legitimacy for the makers as the connective tissue to the hospital systems, to local politicians. So the makers who were, people that were very willing to do something but couldn't get to those places would use the universities as a middleman to ask, hey, could you please introduce us? And then the universities was play sort of a hub and a diplomat in a way to actually match the demand there.
Yeah. Okay, another question. This is a different topic, but thoughts on the tension between donating the PPE versus selling it at or near cost. I know there were strong differences of opinion about this. This is from Russ Browder, but important questions when we weigh considerations such as speed of response, scalability, volunteer labor. So maybe someone could speak a little bit to this dynamic of why didn't people just go sell it, sell their product? What was what were some of the exchanges that happened around donation versus sales?
So I'm sure Guy has some thoughts on this, but I will say anecdotally, just a little bit of thoughts, right? But I think anecdotally, I think one thing that was, I think there's always lessons learned, but one thing that happened at the very beginning was there were some people in our community that were honestly openly shamed, right, for trying to sell PPE, right? And they, tried to justify why they were doing it. Again, shuttered spaces really need to have income streams come in so that they're able to be viable. They're able to provide, fair labor support for the individuals that work in their spaces to be able to do this, right, to compensate folks. But there was just this, in some cases, public shaming of folks that, because I think the ethos was like, this is only gonna last for a couple of weeks, like suck it up, okay, you'll be okay. And so in the beginning, it was really easy to justify like the enormous amount of labor, right? I can push through. I can even push through a month. We got to month 2 and people are like, how long is this gonna go? Can everyone just wear this mask I made you so that you can actually get through this pandemic, right? Like that's where we were at. And then as it, the months go on, you start to feel the fatigue, the real true impact of not paying your rent for many months, right? And not seeing, some of the subsidies come in for your space because it doesn't meet some requirement. Some of our efforts that started up during COVID-19 actually weren't eligible for things like PPP because they had just started, which was one of the exclusion criterions. You couldn't have just started. You had to be an existing entity. So, I think that made it really, really challenging for people. So as it moved on, I think you started to see more makers did think it was acceptable because honestly, it does us no good if everyone in the maker community goes away, right? Like we know what their promise is, right? You have to have sustainability mechanisms. You have to have funding streams that allow you to succeed. I'm going to turn over to Guy because I know he has some really great thoughts on this, but I just wanted to say that quickly.
You said it far more politely than I was gearing up to.
Nice counterbalance here.
Yeah. No, I mean, we have seen that this is a marathon, not a sprint, right? And the people who are still producing are the people who figured out how to do it sustainably. And if you're donating, maybe that means you make 5 to 10 cloth masks a night as a fun hobby, and you buy $50 worth of fabric every week, and like that is your cool hobby, and that's sustainable for you, and you don't burn out, right? Or maybe you have an e-commerce store and you sell things for the price of raw materials plus shipping, right? And you're sustainable that way, and you're probably making more things, right? Or you're selling and actually paying yourself to make these things, and that means that you still pay rent 10 months later into this pandemic, right? And you're still producing things. So it's a spectrum. um, I think the push towards sustainability and making sure people are on firm footing as they are responding to this crisis and this emergency, I think it's not worthy of shame. I think it's worthy of kind of changing everybody's kind of way of thinking about this pandemic, this crisis, this issue, and how you can best be helpful. Um, Certainly, we've seen a lot of price gouging from startup manufacturers that are trying to make a buck, um, in the kind of 1100% markup, you know, peddled by criminal cartels that were moving cocaine in containers months prior, right? Like that's not the world we want to play in. That world is what's supplementing the supply chain now, right? But there is something to be said for don't lose your house because you were trying to help people. Um, and I
It's
think
also an
that's
economic recovery piece too, right? Like, so, I mean, we have to think about these entities, especially the spaces. And I'm not saying that I'm not speaking to the individual makers that also require support and that we want to make sure they have streams of support, but especially for the spaces, these are small businesses. These are America's community small businesses. If we drive them out of business, we're having a different impact that we probably don't want to have, right? Like, so
right.
the reality is we need to find sustainable structures for them to continue to have their doors open, continue to thrive, because they're also the places that are making the new small businesses, right? We're not even getting into that. That's a whole different conversation, but how many small businesses come out of makerspaces, right? So if we shut them down, we're shutting down a whole ecosystem that then feeds into our American economy. So if we say we want to bolster the American economy, we really need to find funding structures for these kinds of things.
Yeah. And I will also just say the remaining piece to that is that there has to be trust between the new people who are making things and the people who are buying things, right? And that trust has to come from somewhere. And where it came from in this particular response is, makerspaces that were known by hospitals or nursing homes or whatever that already had pre-existing relationships, or, individuals who had pre-existing relationships and could offer that trust. That produced the relationships where product moved from one to the other, right? But if you have this ecosystem where a bunch of people are making random things, right? Nobody who's a customer knows what to trust, right? And groups like Facebook and Amazon are restricting new companies from providing things like PPE. From our perspective, the trust comes through the designs, right? You have these common manufacturing pieces of manufacturing equipment that produce the same thing as what was tested in a hospital. So if you make that thing, it is good, right? If you make it to within specifications, it is good. That's not how trust flows right now from the FDA. The FDA approves manufacturers. It doesn't have the ability to approve of tens of thousands of individuals making things. So there has to be a different structure of creating that trust, which is why I will continue to carry the flag of we need a marketplace rooted in sharing designs that are approved. And if makers make those trusted designs, people buying them can feel good about buying a trusted thing to solve this problem. But that actually requires money to build that marketplace, and it requires the ability to trust those players.
Right, and that's one of the functions of the connection between the proposed USPMR, the Prototyping and Manufacturing Reserve, and the digital stockpile, is that you could have designs, potentially a new workflow for the FDA where they would approve designs distinct from production in some ways for trusted members of a network. And there was some positive reaction from the FDA on that idea. It's definitely a new idea. There's a good question about vaccine. Obviously, huge emphasis on vaccine delivery right now. What's the maker crowd doing around syringe bottles? Is there any involvement that we know of?
I'll speak to that. So basically, the vaccine distribution effort is, by far the largest collaborative medical effort in human history. Requires a scale that is far beyond individual makers, whether we're an army of 72,000 or 100,000. This is at a very different scale, right? So we have spent an enormous amount of time studying the vaccine rollout, production, distribution challenges. And we've identified a few things that makers could theoretically make, but it is very, very challenging to insert yourself into these processes because they're at such massive scales. So the one thing that we did find that could be maker made or maker supported, and particularly in places that are low resource, is actually digital temperature tracking devices that can keep track of the individual boxes of delivered vaccine vials to make sure that the temperature does not drop below a certain thing, right? So there's sophisticated products for this, but they're relatively expensive. A lot of local facilities with pretty rudimentary refrigeration units will not be able to have these things in place. So that's one thing that makers could make. But otherwise, we see ourselves also in a role of being able to transport information. We've built a really amazing community of very smart people all around the world. So OSMS is going to publish a small guide towards the vaccines, the different challenges that come with it, how they work, and how you can help other people understand them so that the trust in the vaccines can be increased.
Anybody else on that topic? Lisa Stork posted a question on Facebook, on the Facebook live stream. She said she wanted to ask something about, she wanted us to speak to the emotional impact of doing the aid work, especially when folks are coming from completely non-health industry backgrounds. What has some of the impact been on makers?
So, I mean, I think one thing I can say, and this is more anecdotally than necessarily, I don't know that it's in our report, although there are some conversations that are in our report as well, is that, obviously people are fatigued at this point in general, but I will say from a lot of people, I've heard a lot of makers say the thing that kept them going was knowing that they could have an impact and do something. I think the thing about the pandemic that has been challenging is we don't know when it's going to end, right? Like we have all these predictions, right? And we keep like blowing past, like, oh no, not 2 weeks, oh no, not 2 months, oh not maybe 2 years, I don't know, and that's terrifying. But I think psychologically, I mean, there's lots of articles written on this. It does something to you psychologically to not have an end date to some crisis that you're in, because you're biologically, I'm a neuroscientist by training, you're not biologically, your brain is not wired to allow you to have sort of this crisis response for so long. And so one way around it is doing something, right? And I think so many people did something because I think we're wired to do something, to want to, we're just compelled, we must do something. And so anecdotally, and talking to lots and lots of makers who contributed in different ways to this pandemic, I think a lot of them felt like this was their self-care, right? To be able to say like, hey, I was able to give 10,000 of XYZ to my community. And oh my gosh, I got not a hug because we can't hug anymore, but I got like a virtual hug from a healthcare worker, right? And people in my community really appreciated what I did. And I was able to do this in my house, even though I can't really do anything else. And I do think that had a tremendous impact on folks. I really do think that it really helped on the psychology of many, many makers, helped them find value, especially if some of them were laid off from their primary jobs, or just finding that their makerspace, the place they love, was closed. It just provided so much.
And I also think there's something to be said for, providing for the mental health of the people that you're making things for, right? Like, when you have workers who are going to work without supplies and administrators are saying the plane doesn't arrive until 2 weeks from now, like we ordered something, like deal with it until then, you feel like they don't care, right? And you feel like you're at risk. And then when you receive a box of supplies that are all different color face shields because they came off of 20 people's printers, it's just a different like mindset. It's like, oh, somebody cares, somebody gives a fuck, like this is awesome. And far beyond the particular value of what the supply does for you in a healthcare setting, I think there's a whole mental health aspect of it that's like, oh, I feel cared for by at least somebody out there, even if it's not my boss. And I think that shouldn't be understated. And we do talk about it in the report with a bunch of quotes from people.
That might be a good place to, we could go on and on, clearly. We're heading towards the 2-hour mark here. There will be more discussion today, actually, at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern, on the Make Community Plan C episode. It's actually the last Plan C episode. They've been doing a series on the citizen maker response. Plan C, not Plan A, not Plan B, but Plan C. And today will be the last episode focusing on this report. So if you didn't get enough here, we're gonna do that later. I want to thank everyone for attending, for all of the people that contributed to the report in terms of data, supporting these efforts, and who are continuing to invest in developing maker networks and open source assets and resources for the world at large. Thanks everyone for attending. I really urge you to read the report. It should be live very shortly at osms.li/report. And we'll be also mailing it to folks directly later today.
Thank you so
everybody.
much. I really, really appreciate everything that everyone did. And just, we're really awed by this entire community and their efforts. It's incredible. It's just an incredible honor to be able to document it. And we're so glad that we were able to show this. But I just want to say the work is not ending with this. While certainly, lots of people have slowed down, and we hope that at some point we can stop making PPE and perhaps switch to other things. I think this is a great model for us to look forward as to how we can continue to help our communities and also advocate for the value and the impact of the maker movement. So if you need any help from any of us with making that case, we're happy to help you do so. Please do reach out to us at the information. We will again share these slides, and we look forward to continued conversations. I also will put a plug in for the Nation of Makers Policy Working Group if you're interested in that. We meet on Thursdays. It's a very busy Thursday today at 4 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Pacific time. And you can email me at dorothy@nationofmakers.us for an invitation to that. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.